Over the past number of weeks, Canadian security agencies have been actively pursuing credible allegations of a potential link between agents of the government of India and the killing of a Canadian citizen, Hardeep Singh Nijjar.
Well, frankly, there's a much greater danger for Canada than India. If Canada wants to pick a fight, frankly, at this point, it's like an ant picking a fight against an elephant. And the fact of the matter is, India is the world's largest democracy. It's far more important strategically, arguably, than Canada is, especially as concern grows with regard to China and other matters in the Indian Ocean Basin and in the Pacific. So first, there's that. Second of all, again, while Justin Trudeau might want to make this a case of human rights, the fact of the matter is, Nijjar isn't a model one wants to use for human rights. Nijjar may have been involved in the assassination of a rival Sikh leader just a year ago. At the same time, he has blood on his hands through multiple attacks. He entered Canada with a fraudulent passport. And the fact of the matter is, this is no Mother Teresa we're talking about.
The protection of our citizens and defense of our sovereignty are fundamental. Our top priorities have therefore been, one, that our law enforcement and security agencies ensure the continued safety of all Canadians, and two, that all steps be taken to hold perpetrators of this murder to account.
There's two possibilities here. Either he was shooting from the hip and he doesn't have the evidence to support the accusations he made against the Indian government, or there is something there, in which case he needs to explain why his government was sheltering a terrorist with blood on his hands.
Canada has declared its deep concerns to the top intelligence and security officials of the Indian government. Last week at the G20, I brought them personally and directly to Prime Minister Modi in no uncertain terms.
Let's not fool ourselves. Hardeep Singh Nijjar was not simply a plumber, any more than Osama bin Laden was a construction engineer.
Allegations that a representative of a foreign government may have been involved in the killing of a Canadian citizen here in Canada, on Canadian soil, is not only troubling, but it is completely unacceptable.
Well, the problem is that for the Canadians, there has been a persistent but unconfirmable rumor, a story, if you like, within the Khalistani community in Canada, which, as you know, is large and very active, that this was not some local gangland killing as it first appeared, but rather that it was a state-sponsored assassination by the Indian government. Now, they were not able to produce any evidence of this, which didn't stop them making the accusation loudly and often. They prepared, as you probably know, posters which they put up at parades and demonstrations at Indian missions in Canada, the consulate in Toronto, in Vancouver, and the High Commission in Ottawa. These posters describing Indian diplomats as killers, and I quote, and basically painting targets on the backs of these diplomats. None of this rested on any evidence that we know of until today, when Prime Minister Trudeau, having been somewhat humiliated, I think, by Prime Minister Modi at the G20 summit, when he was granted a very brief and very frosty meeting, at which Modi basically scolded Trudeau, a sort of diplomatic punch in the nose, if you will. It certainly wasn't very diplomatic, accusing him of harboring people in Canada who are threatening Indian diplomats, which was true. That is why I say it was somewhat humiliating for Prime Minister Trudeau, who today announced that, well, I've got a surprise for you, that now we do have evidence, although he didn't say what it was. He merely said that we have credible allegations, in his words, for a potential link between this murder and Indian agents of the Indian government. He hasn't proved it. He's merely made the allegation, but that hasn't stopped him acting on it by booting out a senior Indian diplomat, and in return, the Indians have done the same. But I don't think that'll end it.
Any involvement of a foreign government in the killing of a Canadian citizen on Canadian soil is an unacceptable violation of our sovereignty. It is contrary to the fundamental rules by which free, open, and democratic societies conduct themselves.
Was somehow the fault of agents working on behalf of the Indian government. Now, the Prime Minister's incompetence has severely damaged Canada's relations with the world's largest democracy and an emerging power in Asia. Will the Prime Minister finally do the right thing and produce some kind of proof of his conspiracy theory?
How can he do this without revealing his evidence? I don't think he can, because I think that what's going to happen tomorrow and the next day and the next day is the pressure is going to mount to say, well, what is this evidence? Why do you say these allegations are credible? What is the potential link that you're alleging? Because without that, it's just not going to fly. And the Indians, I don't suppose, are going to put up with it. They're not going to sit there quietly while the Canadian government produces no evidence for its position. So I think that over time, either through a procedure of leaks, or some sort of announcement, or some nice little off-the-record private briefing for chosen reporters, that one way or the other, it's going to get out what the government is talking about. And all I can tell you is that it better be good, because if it's not, this is just going to blossom into an even bigger embarrassment for Prime Minister Trudeau.
In the strongest possible terms, I continue to urge the Government of India to cooperate with Canada to get to the bottom of this matter.
What diplomatic relations? I mean, we've gone from cool to frosty, and now we're right in the deep freeze. It doesn't get worse between what are nominally allies, democratic allies, than when you start booting each other's diplomats out of the country. Now, it seems to me that it's only going to get worse before it gets better, for the reasons that I gave a moment ago, that without the Canadian government producing evidence, the pressure is just going to mount until they have to produce something. Otherwise, it's going to be absurd, because Canada is promising to go to other allies and share what we have learned, for example, with the British. And say, because they have a similar problem with Khalistanis in Britain. And Prime Minister Rishi Sunak at the G20, as you recall, pledged that Britain would not allow any space for Khalistani violence or extremism in Britain. And that was generally considered satisfactory, I think, by the Indian side. But there was no such pledge on the Canadian side. If it had been made before, it might have cut the mustard, but as it is now, with this, as I say, deep freeze atmosphere, a real Canadian chill, if you will, then I don't think it'll be enough for Canada to say, okay, we're going to make a statement like Prime Minister Sunak and a pledge to allow no space, blah, 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 for Khalistani protesters. It's too late for that now. Now they have to take much firmer action. Now they have to show, in order to satisfy the Indian side, much firmer action against what they consider activities that should be illegal, but inconveniently for the Indians are not illegal in Canada. It's not illegal in Canada to go down the street, marching down the street with a flag and saying, there's free speech. Trudeau is correct about that, and no Western democracy, I don't think, is going to abolish freedom of speech in order to please the Indians. However, most countries have introduced legislation in recent years against the incitement of terrorism, the incitement of violence, the glorification of terrorism. I'm quoting from the British legislation, for example, which was passed in the 2006 United Kingdom Anti-Terrorism Act. So that's 17 years ago, the British woke up to this problem and acted and introduced legislation so that you cannot legally counsel violence, incite violence or terrorism. And we've got plenty of incitement. We've got plenty of people glorifying terrorism in Canada. You can put up posters glorifying even the Kanishka bomber, the worst mass murderer in Canadian history. Talvinder Parmar blew up Flight 182 of Air India in 1985, killing 331 completely innocent civilians. And it's perfectly legal to put up a poster of him glorifying him as a great hero and shaheed of the Sikh nation and a model for Sikh youth. You can put out these posters, for example, that I mentioned. The posters describing Indian diplomats as killers. And they've even, as you may have heard, had a demonstration going through the streets of Toronto, Canada's largest city, with a diorama celebrating, with life-size figures, celebrating the assassination of Indira Gandhi in 1984. And that, too, is perfectly legal, even though it is plainly an incitement to violence. It's a glorification of terrorism. So Canada needs to get busy on that front, I believe, in my personal opinion. Now they've upped the ante. They've escalated this conflict with India to the point where they really must do something more than just say nice words.
As you would expect, we've been working closely and coordinating with our allies on this very serious matter.
Frankly, many in the United States security community, and I believe actually many in the Canadian security community, probably understand that Justin Trudeau has gone too far. So this isn't a fight he wants to have. I suspect that the United States doesn't want to be pinned in the corner to choose between two friends, but if we have to choose between two friends, increasingly we're going to choose India on this matter, simply because Najjar was a terrorist, and India is too important, our relationship is too important. Justin Trudeau probably isn't long for the Canadian premiership, and then we can rebuild the relationship after.